In 539 BCE, the Achaemenid king Cyrus II conquered Babylon and much of Mesopotamia, Syria, and other regions of the Middle East. Between this date and the Muslim conquest in 640 CE, the region was conquered by Alexander, then by the Parthians, and finally became part of the Iranian Empire, once again under the Sasanians, who reigned from 224 CE until the Muslim conquest. The cultural and social changes that followed these successive invasions were generally not abruptly imposed, but occurred gradually as indigenous Moors fused with those of the conquerors. Although little is known about women during the period of these successive invasions, the exchange of Moors following from them appears to have led to a decline in the status of women and to the broader dissemination of the more negative attitudes toward women. For instance, A.L. Oppenheim singles out a decline in the position of women as one of the few key points of change after the Iranian conquest of Mesopotamia. Women could no longer serve as witnesses, and new restrictions were placed on their participation in the legal transactions of their husbands. Among other things, the lives of royalty also suggest the possibility that the series of conquests and ensuing cultural exchanges that occurred in the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean regions from about the middle of the first millennium BCE to the Islamic conquests led to a decline in the status of women and the spread of practices implying their further devaluation. Alexander, for example, vastly increased the size of his harem after he defeated King Darius of Persia in 333 BCE. The harem he captured from Darius consisted of the king's mother and wife, each traveling in her own car and attended by her own troop of women on horseback, 15 carriages carrying the king's children, their nurses, and a crowd of eunuchs, and more carriages carrying Darius's 365 concubines. By this time, the custom of secluding women was in place. The carriages carrying them were closed. Thereafter, presumably in imitation of the ruler he had conquered, Alexander kept a harem of exactly the same number of concubines as Darius. In addition to a number of eunuchs accustomed to being used like women, the size of royal harems was to grow so large that by Sasanian times, when concubines numbered in the thousands, a harem of 365 concubines would come to seem modest, niggardly, as one scholar described it. Similarly, the Muslim conquests of regions in which large harems were the norm among royalty, the size of royal Muslim harems also vastly increased. The exchange of Moors was not confined to royalty and the elite, although only these classes had the means to keep large harems that were secluded and guarded by eunuchs. Veiling and the confinement of women spread throughout the region and became the ordinary social practices, as did the attitudes to women and to the human body, such as a sense of the shamefulness of the body and sexuality that accompanied such practices. During the first Christian centuries, the notion of women's seclusion, architecturally realized as a building or area for women in the residence, guarded by eunuchs, together with veiling and attitudes about the proper invisibility of women, became features of upper class life in the Mediterranean Middle East, Iraq, and Persia. Indeed, such attitudes and practices were found as much on the northern shores of the Mediterranean, in Byzantine society, for example, as on the southern shores, widespread by the early Christian era. They did not emanate, as is often suggested, solely from the Persian world, but seem rather to represent a coalescence of similar attitudes and practices originating within the various patriarchal cultures of the region: Mesopotamian, Persian, Hellenic, Christian, and eventually Islamic cultures. Each contributed practices that both controlled and diminished women, and each also apparently borrowed the controlling and reductive practices of its neighbors. Cultural exchange seems to have led above all to the pooling and reinforcement of such ideas and to the triumphant endorsement throughout the region of a notion of woman in which her humanity was submerged and all but obliterated by a view of her as essentially and even exclusively biological, as quintessentially a sexual and reproductive being. The spread of reductive and controlling practices and misogynist ideas at this time and in this region is striking. And it is also striking that attitudes that apparently recognized women's humanity as well as their biological capacity, attitudes that had also existed in this region, as will be discussed in Chapter 2, conversely did not spread and were not copied and exchanged from one culture to another. Indeed, even within each particular culture, Mesopotamian, Hellenic, Christian, and Islamic, it was the more humane ideas regarding women that apparently were consistently lost. And those increasing male control and diminishing women that consistently gained ground. For both the West and the Middle East, the societies of this period in this region and the ideas to which they gave rise have exercised and continue to exercise a controlling power over history. Sasanian society, which prevailed in the Iraq-Iran region, is particularly important to the present work in that the Muslims conquered its people and directly inherited its culture and institutions. The Moors of the incoming Arabs and the existing society fused after the conquest, and the new Muslim society that arose in Iraq played a key role in defining Muslim law and institutions, including many which are still in place today. Customs of the Persian royalty at the time of the first Persian conquest of Mesopotamia continued to be practiced and became even more elaborate under the Sasanians. Harems grew vastly larger and were kept by the elite as well as by royalty, their size reflecting the owner's wealth and power. The Achaemenid practice of sending women from the provinces to the king's harem or on approval continued in Sasanian times as an additional refinement. Certain kings circulated their specifications of ideal beauty throughout their territories. Another carryover from Achaemenid times into at least early Sasanian times was the practice of incestuous marriage, in which a man was permitted to marry his sister, his daughter, or even his mother. These unions were not merely tolerated, but indeed regarded as acts of piety and great merit, and even efficacious against the demonic forces. The paramount religion among the upper classes was Zoroastrianism, a monotheistic religion perhaps dating as far back as the first millennium BCE. During the Sasanian period, Zoroastrianism grew in power and influence and eventually became the state religion, establishing the regulations that governed male-female relationships among the upper classes. The patriarchal family as endorsed by this church, at least in this period of its history, demanded the wife's total obedience to her husband. She was required to declare, "I will never cease all my life to obey my husband," and was subject to divorce if she failed to do so. She was also required every morning on rising to present herself before her husband and 9 times make her obeisance, arms extended in greeting to him as men did praying to Ormazd. Producing a male heir was religiously enjoined, and the various marriage arrangements that were possible reflected the priority placed on men's producing male heirs, if not directly, then through their daughters or other female kin. Thus, the daughter of a man who had produced no male offspring had to be given in a form of marriage in which the offspring, and in particular the male offspring, belonged to her father or to her patriarchal family if he was dead. In such a marriage, a woman had fewer rights than in a patakashai marriage, in which the children belonged to her husband. Similarly, widows of men who had produced no heirs, even women whose betrothed husband had died in childhood, entered into marriages in which the offspring belonged to the deceased husband's family and in which they did not have the rights of patakashai wives, the only type of wives entitled to be treated as mistresses of the house. A man could also loan his wife to another man without her consent, the terms of the loan being specified by contract. This practice was recommended in particular when a widower could not afford to marry yet required a woman to supply sexual services and to raise his children. Any offspring that might ensue belonged to the husband, according to the belief that a woman is a field, all which grows there belongs to its owner, even if he did not plant it. Wife loaning was regarded by Sasanian jurists as a fraternal act, an act of solidarity with a member of one's community, which was sanctified as a religious duty. Husbands had rights to property acquired by the wife after the marriage unless a contract had specified otherwise. If she disobeyed him, she lost even these contractually specified rights. Her disobedience had to be proved in court. Then the court issued a certificate of disobedience. A woman inherited the share of her husband's property that belonged to her, although the husband was the usufructuary. If she died childless, it reverted to her father's family. A patiksayi widow had the right to a share of her husband's estate equal to her son's. When widowed, she passed to the guardianship of an adult son or the nearest agnate of the deceased husband. Divorce generally required the agreement of both parties unless the wife was guilty of a misdemeanor, in which case her consent was not necessary. Divorce became compulsory even if the woman was needed to supply heirs for her father, brother, or other male relative, in which case she had to marry an agnate of that relative. While scholars of the subject commonly state that women might thus be compelled into such marriages, to the point of having to divorce a current husband to fulfill this duty, they also make the apparently contradictory statement that women could not be given in marriage against their will. The strict class system of the Zoroastrians also played an important part in controlling marriage and women's status in marriage. Class distinctions were rigidly demarcated, even dictating who could and who could not wear silk, and women were required to marry within their social class. Elements of these Zoroastrian regulations suggest that notionally women were somewhere between personhood and thingness, as evidenced by wives being legally loaned for sexual and other services. An account of the Mazdakian revolutionary movement that arose in Iran during the Sasanian era also suggests that women were regarded in some sense as things, as well as perhaps persons. Mazdakianism was a religious movement that flourished in the late 5th and early 6th centuries CE. It was populist and egalitarian, preaching the equitable distribution of wealth and the breaking of barriers, which made for the concentration of women and wealth in the hands of the privileged classes. As the Arabic historiographer Tabari reports, followers of this movement declared that God placed the means of subsistence on earth so that people divide them among themselves equally in a manner that no one of them could have more than his share, and therefore that it was absolutely necessary that one take from the rich for giving to the poor, so that all become equal in wealth. Whoever possesses an excess of property, women, or goods, he has no more right to it than another. Because such accounts of Mazdakian beliefs are not their own, originating for the most part in sources hostile to them, their own accounts were destroyed in the course of the persecution. And because they have filtered down to us through yet another civilization, we cannot assume that the clear equation between women and things was indeed Mazdakian. The notion of women as things, as well as persons, nevertheless appears to inhere in the Zoroastrian laws just described that govern women, even without reference to the Mazdakian thought. One student points out that slaves belong to the category of things, but that because of internal contradictions running through legal thought, they were also regarded as persons to some extent. He goes on to observe that even when the slave was considered not only as an object of right, but also as a subject, his legal standing never exceeded that of a subordinate person, a woman, a ward. While the thingness versus the personhood of slaves has received scholarly attention, there is no comparable exploration of the ambiguities in the status of women. The same author confines his remarks on this matter to the observation that, in connection with the legal personality, it should be noted that the scope of a person's legal capacity and competence varied with sex and age. Women and minors had a limited passive legal capacity. Zoroastrianism in Iraq, as distinct from Iran, was principally the religion of the Persians, who predominantly constituted the ruling, warrior, and priestly classes. The population as a whole was religiously diverse and included Gnostics, pagans, Manichaeans, Jews, and, in increasing numbers from the 2nd century on, Christians. Both Jewish and Christian communities were self-governing under the Sasanians and were generally tolerated along with other non-Zoroastrian groups, although they also underwent periods of persecution. The fortune of Christians in particular, including the extent to which they were persecuted, tended to depend on the relation of the Sasanian Empire with its arch-rival, the Byzantine Empire, which adopted Christianity as the state religion in 330 CE. It also varied with the degree to which the Zoroastrian church felt threatened by Christianity at a given moment, spreading first, perhaps chiefly, among the Armenian and Armenian and Arab populations of Syria and Iraq, Christianity was increasingly adopted by Iranians as well, including members of the highest ranking elite. For example, King Khosrau II, who lived from 591 to 628 CE, had 2 Christians among his wives. Women as well as men were among the early Iranian Christian martyrs. Although the Christian church endorsed male dominance, the narratives of the female martyrs suggest that it nevertheless introduced ideas which opened new avenues of self-affirmation and independence to women and validated ways to resist the belief that women were defined by their biology and existed essentially to serve the function of reproduction. Thus, Christianity promulgated ideas that were fundamentally subversive of the Zoroastrian social order in 2 ways. It enabled women to claim spiritual and moral authority and affirm their own understanding of the moral order, in defiance of male priestly authority, and it undercut the notion on which Zoroastrian laws on women were grounded, that reproduction was their primary function. With one exception, every case of Christian martyrdom, collected by Sebastian Brock and Susan Harvey in Holy Women of the Syrian Orient, features a woman who took a vow of chastity. The issues of chastity and of resistance to marriage were the central conflict in the battle of wills between the prosecuting Zoroastrian priests and each woman. To Martha, martyred in the 4th century, a Zoroastrian priest even declared that she might continue to be a Christian. All that he required was that she renounce her virginity, a condition particularly abhorrent to Zoroastrian Moors. Observed Brock and Harvey. The priest proclaimed, "Listen to me, and don't be stubborn and obstinate, following your own perverted wishes in everything. Instead, seeing that you are set on not giving up your religion, act as you like, but do this one thing only, and you shall live and not die. You are a young girl and a very pretty one. Find a husband, get married, have sons and daughters, and don't hold on to the disgusting pretext of the covenant that is devout chastity." The wise Virgin Martha replied, "If a virgin is betrothed to a man, does the natural law order that someone else should come along, attack her fiancé, and snatch away this girl who has already been betrothed? Or does it say that such a virgin should give herself up to marry a man who is not her fiancé?" "No," answered the mobed. Briefly taken in and believing Martha to be betrothed to a man, the priest was momentarily sympathetic until he realized that she was speaking of Christ, whereupon he exploded in rage, saying, "I will spatter you from head to toe with blood, and then your fiancé can come along and find you turned into dust and rubbish." Martha went to her death thanking Jesus for preserving my virginity, sealed up with the imprint of the seal ring of our promise, and for preserving my faith in the glorious Trinity. 69 to 70, 71. Tarbo, the exceedingly beautiful sister of the martyr Simeon, who died 341, Bishop of Seleucia Ctesiphon, had also taken a vow of chastity. She, her sister, who was married but lived in chastity, and her servant were accused of putting a spell on the queen who had fallen ill. The priest who examined them sent Tarbo word that he would save them if she consented to be his wife. Tarbo replied, "Shut your mouth, you wicked man, an enemy of God. Don't ever again utter anything so disgusting. I am the betrothed of Christ. In his name I am preserving my virginity. I entrust my life to him. since he is able to deliver me from your impure hands and from your evil intentions concerning me. Foul and perverted man, why do you crazily rave after something that is neither proper nor permissible? I shall die a heroic death, for thus shall I obtain true life. I will not live in an ignominious way and then eventually die. 74 to 75. She and her companions were then subjected to gruesome deaths. Other martyrs were similarly chaste, or virgin women living together, like Anahid, daughter of the Magian, Adorhormizd, in a cell alone. The one exception, Candida, the 2nd century martyr and emperor's wife, died as a result of harem machinations. The prosecuting priests made marriage, rather than the verbal renunciation of faith, the condition of their release. Among the constant features of these narratives are the priests' explosive anger and the women's derisive challenges to priestly and male authority. For instance, one priest turned green with anger and shame when, in reply to his question, "What are you?" his victim Martha said, "I am a woman, as you can see." 68. And Anahid's reply to the priest persecuting her begins, "You silly and senseless man." 93. In another narrative, the woman's refusal to make herself sexually available and to be equated wholly with her sexual being figures in her torture and her response to it. At one point, her breasts are severed. Her 2 breasts were quickly cut through and hung each by a mere sinew. The holy woman stretched out her hands, grabbed her breasts, and placed them in front of the Magian with the words, "Seeing that you very much wanted them, O Magian, here they are. Do with them whatever takes your fancy. If I have any other limbs you would like, give the order and I will cut them off and put them in front of you." 95. The value placed on virginity in early Christianity by religious thinkers in particular was to a certain extent an expression of a rejection of physicality of the body, and in particular of sexuality, and it was a rejection that comprehended an element of misogyny in that notionally women were seen as more implicated in physicality and the body than men, that they were, by cultural definition, essentially sexual and biological beings. This misogynist element, moreover, was given clear expression in the writings of early Christian religious thinkers, as will be discussed in chapter 2. Nevertheless, the Church's emphasis on the merit of transcending the body and its valuing virginity and sexual purity in women, as well as in men, at the same time radically struck at the roots of the definition of women, and as essentially and exclusively biological beings that prevailed in many of the cultures of the region in this period. Celibate, independent women, women who consulted only their own will and that of their God, whom they consulted directly, constituted a challenge and a threat both to male authority and to the fundamental notions enshrined in the socio-religious order of the day.